about about blending instructional strategies for instructional design and delivery. In other words, what kind of things can we do in some of the different different platforms that we're using? In other words, we're utilizing face-to-face instruction. We're utilizing synchronous, which is basically what we're doing right now. And we're also utilizing asynchronous, which is posting things on the LMS through our Blackboard shell. And this is just a variety of different opportunities. In fact, if you think about this, this is really a tremendous thing. When you are blending like this, or there's other terms that you're going to hear. You're going to hear hybrid. You're going to hear the term blending. You'll hear the term flipping. All of those kind of things are basically working with the same premise. And basically what they're doing is they're talking about expanding the pedagogical opportunities. So it's no longer just what we do in class and then what you send the students out to do on their own. This now also starts to incorporate a synchronous session like this. It also incorporates an asynchronous session where they're doing things on their own at their own time and at their own pace, during a particular period of time where they're not in front of you. And it incorporates that face-to-face component. So if you think about this, this is really a tremendous opportunity to really think through some different pedagogies and figure out what's best taught where. I'm a firm believer that there are certain things that are just better taught in a face-to-face setting, and certain things that you just can't transition as well to the online. Oh, you can do it, but it's just not as good. There are also things in my mind that are better taught online. Example, the one I'll throw out to you, and before we even jump into this, is the idea of discussions. I want you to think about this a second. When you've got a group of students sitting in front of you, either like this through a synchronous session or in a face-to-face setting where they're sitting in a classroom with you, you throw out a discussion prompt. Now, you throw out some kind of a question to the group. What does everybody do? Most people don't participate. Generally what you find is when you throw out a question and you stand there with that pregnant pause and waiting to see, who's going to respond and answer, people's wheels are turning, but the majority of people are going, and how many people do look down and start writing ferociously so that you'll think they're too busy to call on them? They just don't participate. And the people who do participate, what do? It's usually some kind of a superficial answer. It's something right off the top of their head. It's not a very, very deep response. It's not something that they're pulling from the readings or from the material that you're doing. It's just something superficial off the top of their head. But if you do an online discussion, in other words, through a discussion board, people can't hide. Everybody has to participate. You're going to be spending more time with them, but this becomes a different opportunity. They're going to take time to write a cogent thought. They'll pull from the materials. They'll pull from the textbook. They'll pull from a lot of things, and they'll provide a lot of different insights. And then you have it. Now, as we said the other day, that provides a lot more time on your part, but everybody is involved. Everybody responds because they have to, and they can't hide. And you can have them and set up parameters that they can interact with each other. So sometimes, I'm not saying every discussion, but this is what you as the instructor have to kind of figure out. What is the best pedagogy at the best moment? And I'll also tell you something. Just because it works today doesn't mean it'll work tomorrow. So you have to keep things mixed up. You have to try a variety of different pedagogies. I've seen instructors who in an online or an asynchronous will put up 3 or 4 discussion boards per week. Well, students get bored with that. It's the same repetitive thing over and over again. You can't do that. And you've seen that when you have students in your face-to-face classes that you're using, or you've known instructors that just continually use the same pedagogy over and over, students lose a little bit of energy. They lose a little bit of enthusiasm. So something to think about is to try and keep your pedagogies mixed up, keep your instructional strategies mixed up. And providing this opportunity where you are actually scheduling synchronous, asynchronous, and face-to-face, this is a tremendous opportunity, and especially at this point where you're building new curriculum, to kind of figure, okay, what would be best taught face-to-face? In other words, what things can't I do online, either synchronous or asynchronous? Let me give you an example, and I'll give you an example out of the nursing program specifically. You know, they teach skills, and think about it. There are certain skills that you can teach online. A number of computer skills, I think, can be taught online, teaching people how to do certain things. I'll show you a basic one today that we do. There are other things I don't think can be taught online. Out of the nursing program, think about this. If you were trying to teach somebody to take a blood pressure, could you do that online? Well, yeah, you probably can teach them. You can, tell them what, a blood pressure cuff is, a sphygmomanometer, which many of you may be surprised I can say sphygmomanometer. Talking about systolic and diastolic pressures and all of that. And you can go through and do all of the didactic, do all of the knowledge base, the cognitive domain. But when it actually comes to the skill and having them actually do it, you can demonstrate that through a video like this, or you can demonstrate how to do this through synchronous, but you can't tell with them in front of you through formative evaluation whether they're doing it correctly. You can have them send you a video, but you just don't know. Are they getting the right answer? It's one of those things that is better taught in a face-to-face. So as you're going through your curriculum now, knowing that you have students with you for several hours in a face-to-face setting, you can plan the dynamic of what you need to teach face-to-face and what you can teach synchronous and asynchronous, and which better fits into those different modes. So let's kind of move through some of this, and I'll quit blathering on. All right, so deciding what pedagogies use or what modality in those different three is really not that black and white. In other words, what would fit in Donna's class may not fit in Jamie's class, may not fit in Petra's class. You have to kind of decide and take a look at where you are, what your course is, how much skill is involved, how much knowledge is involved, how many concepts, and what does kind of fit logically into any one of those three modalities. So a lot of this is based upon what we talked about last week, last week, which was basing everything off of your objectives. Start with what you want the student to be like when they leave your classroom. And as we said, there are some things I think that are better taught online, some things that are better taught on ground, some things that may be taught better synchronously. And some things doesn't matter. You could do just as well in all three modalities. You kind of find that some workarounds you may have to think about. And a lot of times on our part as instructors, it just requires that we think digitally. In other words, understanding how we can transition things and what kind of things we can do. So let's talk first about direct instruction. What I want to do today is go through some basic things. We'll go through direct instruction. We'll talk about cooperative learning, which is group work type things. We'll talk about some project-based learning or problem-based learning. We'll talk about simulations, case studies. And then if we have time, we'll go through that pedagogical handout that talks about all the different kinds of pedagogies that you can use and how you can do some things and transition over. So there may be some different ideas. So direct instruction, a lot of people think it is just solely lecture. And that's not quite correct. In fact, direct instruction has gotten a kind of a bad rap over the years as being too teacher-centric. That's also not exactly correct when you start talking about it. When you talk and say direct instruction, you think one thing, but it is actually referring to a very rigorously developed, highly scripted method for teaching that is fast-paced, provides constant interaction between students and teacher, and really does move the student through that learning process to master skills, knowledge, facts, all of those kind of things. It is a highly structured type of a process of teaching. And it's not as teacher-centric, if you would. In other words, it's not just the teacher doing. Oh, the teacher initially does through a demonstration or lecture. I like to call them lecturettes because they're a little shorter. When I think of lectures, I think of somebody that's doing exactly what I'm doing, which is standing there and talking for an hour, trying to interact with you, but standing there generally talking. That's not what direct instruction is. Direct instruction is something a little different. It's based upon the work of B.S. Skinner, Thorndike, Thorndike and Watson, and then within the concepts of behaviorism. It works with the idea of strengthening behavior through positive and negative reinforcements. In other words, when a student is doing something correctly, you reinforce that. When they're doing something wrong, you correct it. It's really contrary to the social learning theory that Albert Bandura postures. He says that humans learn through the observation and interaction with others. He also states that most learning is done by selectively observing and placing into memory the behavior of others. Well, that may or may not be, because if you think about it, when a teacher does direct instruction, they're going to stand up there and they're going to demonstrate how to do something. So in essence, maybe there is more of a link between social learning theory and direct instruction than maybe previously thought. There is a controversy between the two that you will hear within the literature. And if you look, and there's a link, if you go and pull this up, there's a link here to a halfway decent article through Edudata. It talks about the idea that direct instruction is thought to be too teacher-centered and too much teacher talk. And that's the old argument for too much lecturing. And how many of our colleagues do we know when you're walking up and down the corridors, you see instructors just are simply lecturing a lot? Now, that depends upon the subject. You know, if you're a history teacher, yeah, maybe there is a little bit more lecture. Maybe there is a little bit more teacher discussion. It also supports the view that students are empty containers to fill. So direct instruction works with the idea that they're not as self-directed, but that they're empty vessels. All we do is open their head and pour in the knowledge and skill. Well, that may or may not be accurate, in the sense that as adult learners that you're dealing with, yes, we are self-directed, but we don't always know what it is that we need to learn or the skills that we need to have. That's where we as instructors and professors come into play here with this. In order to do direct instruction appropriately, there's a 5-step process to it. Number one, you establish a set or decide what it is that you're going to teach. You explain and demonstrate that and really break things down into bite-sized pieces, if you would. It's that old adage, how do you eat an elephant? You eat an elephant one bite at a time. Well, this is no different. So what you're doing for the student is you're breaking this, whatever this is that you're teaching them, you break it down into bite-sized pieces so they can absorb it, process it, learn it, and internalize it. Then you provide, after you've shown them what to do and demonstrate that, so in essence, think of it, you're providing the model, then you give them guided practice where they are practicing something with you there. Now, that can be with you there synchronously, asynchronously, or face-to-face. And we'll talk about a little more of that when we move forward. With that guided practice, then you're giving them feedback on what they're doing correctly, what they're doing incorrectly. And that goes back to the Skinner model, where you're in the Skinner boxes. When they're doing something properly, you reward them. When they're not doing something properly, Skinner would just ignore that behavior. But in teaching, we don't ignore the behavior. Basically, what we do is we correct ineffective behavior, or things that they're doing wrong, we correct it. Because think about it, if you as an instructor don't correct a mistake that somebody's making, then they think it's what they're doing is correct, especially if they know you've seen them. And then you provide some type of an extended practice that they can begin to apply this more in their own area and make it more of an authentic type of an experience. We know that students learn, will retain more, and internalize more when they have that extended experience. In other words, when they can provide that and put that in their own venue or put it into a real life setting. The idea of this is focused on academic tasks and student engagement, and it's just a whole series of highly structured elements that kind of come together very nicely. So let's build a direct instruction lesson together and kind of talk through that. And as we go through each of these, I want you to think of a specific lesson that you would teach, something that is small. I would tell you to keep it very, very simple. And I would tell you, just for our perspective now, make it skills-based. Think of some skill that you would teach in your class. Okay, keep it very, very small. The example that I'm going to use, and this I'll take from an objective. So this is where we now start to operationalize our objectives. So if I took the objective that is here on the slide, it says the student will be able to correctly create and post announcements and hyperlinks given a Blackboard shell. So if we go back to last week, this has all 5 elements that we were talking about. It is written for the student will be able to. It is measurable, They will be able to create and post, so I will be able to see that. It is specific enough as to what we're doing and talking about announcements and hyperlinks. It has the conditions of performance. In other words, what am I giving them? I'm having to give them a Blackboard shell. And how well do they have to do this? Well, they have to correctly do it. I mean, we could say 100% or accurately, whatever other word, but this is basically what it is. And some people choose not to put those words in. That's fine because they become assumed. But you need to understand that if there is a certain standard within your profession, maybe you have the standard is 95% of the time something happens. In hospital settings, they may establish that, IVs are successful 86% of the time. I don't know. And that may be something that is established either by some accrediting body or by some internal quality assurance group. Doesn't matter. As long as it's just not arbitrary on your part, as long as it is something that relates, then you're good with that. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about, and this is the example I'm going to use. You guys think of one on your own while you're doing this, and we'll kind of build through as we go. So phase one is what we call establishing the set, or you establish the goals. So this is the teacher gets the students ready by going over the goals and objectives of the lesson, providing background info and explaining the importance, or basically what we talk about is the who cares. And this is really where the teacher is doing in education. We call this an anticipatory set. This is where we kind of establish and tell the student, why is this important that you're learning, and where are you going to apply this? This also works, if you think about it, right within that affective domain where we have the student being able to value what we're trying to teach them. So it just is one of those things that we utilize to kind of set the tone for what's going to be learned. So if a student doesn't know what they're going to be learning or why they're learning it, then they're less likely to pay attention, less likely to internalize. So start with this. So the example we're using here is creating announcements and hyperlinks in Blackboard. And the objective I kind of went through before, but I reposted it. So I'll give everybody just a second. Think about that and the kind of lesson that you're doing. Take a minute and write down exactly what it is that you would be doing. Okay. Okay, next we have phase two, which is the explanation and demonstration phase. This is where the instructor correctly demonstrates the skill or presents what we call step-by-step information. Example, in mathematics, you would say, well, it's not a physical skill. I'm showing them how to solve quadratic equations, and there's a set of 4 or 5 steps that they have to go through each time. So I break that down, and that's one of those things I would probably argue is mental skills in many respects. Within your program, I think you have some very, as I've read through your objectives, I think you have some very, very specific things that you teach. I think there are some very specific skills. I think there's some very specific physical and or mental skills that you're breaking down. So the exercise here is to think of your skill and what are the basic steps. List those steps out. Now, here, let me give you an example of what I'm doing. In creating announcements and using hyperlinks in Blackboard or the Blackboard LMS, these are the 6 steps. Usually you want to keep it around 3 to 6 steps. Okay, sometimes more, sometimes less, it just depends. And if you can break it down and chunk it, yes, you may have sub-steps if you would, or things to do, which this does. So step number 1 is at the bottom left, click on, in other words, once you're in a course shell, on the bottom left on the course tools, then click announcements. 2, click on the create announcement button. 3, fill in your subject and add your announcement using a conversational tone. What is that conversational tone? Anybody know what I'm talking about with conversational tone? Anybody ever heard of that before? Anybody? Donna? You look like you had a...
Are you talking about... Oh, go ahead.
Jamie, go ahead.
It's simply as though you were talking with them.
Perfect. Bingo. That is absolutely correct. The conversational tone is the way that you talk to students when you're face-to-face with them. When you are sitting with them in a face-to-face setting, we generally use a conversational tone. But when people get online like this, they lose focus with that conversational tone and become very, very formalized. And it kind of loses that rapport, that connection with students. Same thing when you are in an asynchronous environment. You want to make sure you use that conversational tone. And this gets a little weird sometimes, but when you are sitting there and you're typing out text and instructions, don't make it so formal that you disconnect with students. Type out exactly the way you would communicate with them if they were sitting in front of you. Now, this is also the thing, if you're creating narrated PowerPoints, okay, and doing narrated presentations, which are very, very simple to do. If you're doing that, it gets a little weird because you're doing that in your family room, you're doing it in your office, you're doing it somewhere where you're sitting there talking to no one. And it just gets a little weird as you're kind of doing that. In fact, I've always told my wife, well, I'm going downstairs, and she says, yeah, I know, you're going down there to teach to nobody. And that's basically what it is. You're just recording, and it just gets a little weird. But you have to think about how the students are receiving that. So you have to talk in your narrated PowerPoints the way you would talk to them in face-to-face. So in whatever way you're doing this, you want to use that conversational tone. It really does help make a connection with students through all three of these modalities. And that's one of the biggest things. We know from the literature that students who have a great rapport with their instructor or have interaction and make that connection learn better. We know that in a K through 12 setting. We also know that in the literature in higher education. If you don't make a connection, think about your classes. Think about the classes that you learned the most when you were in any level of school, from PhD, doctoral, all the way back down to kindergarten. The teachers that stood out in your mind are the ones that you had the greatest connection with. This conversational tone assists with that. So that's step 3. Step 4 is find web announcement options, set desired restrictions. And there's also under that one, there'd be a lot of little sub things to do, and I'll show you what I do with that. Number 5 is to scroll to the course link and click on browse and click on the file or area you want the students to go. Okay, that's to set the hyperlink. And then you just click submit. So there's just 5, I keep it as simple as I could to 5 to 6 basic steps. So how can I do this in the 3 different modalities? In a face-to-face, it's really quite simple. All I would do is project on the screen. In the setup that we have in our classrooms, it's very simple. I would use the computer. I would use the smart board that we have. I would stand up there and walk them through it and have them see exactly what I'm doing, where I'm clicking, what screens pop up, all of that. So it's just really just a demo in front of the room. If I was doing it synchronously, would do the exact same thing, except I would just share my screen like I'm doing right now and walk them through step by step how to do something. If I'm doing this asynchronously, what I would do is I would develop a narrated PowerPoint. Let me show you what I have done for this. Shoot, went too far back. This is a PowerPoint that I've developed that just kind of walks them through. It's announcements and hyperlinks. Now, I didn't put the version of, I have a narrated version of this. Basically what I do is I just walk them through this, and it just runs automatically, almost like a video, creating announcements and I talk over this, and it keeps coming. What I've done is I do screenshots. In other words, when I'm doing this and set this up, I will just simply do screenshots of what I'm showing them or what I want to focus on. I just cut them down, and then I put arrows in, and then just little things. And then I talk through this process. The announcement page pops up. Click on the Create Announcement button. The Create Announcement page pops up. Fill in your subject and add your announcement. And I give them an example announcement. Add your subject, and I put all the arrows in. And that's one of the things that you have to do if you're doing something like this. You have to preset all of your animations. You have to preset the same way that you would do this in a face-to-face setting, where you've got it, if you're using animations like this, that things pop up. And I use arrows just to highlight certain areas of a screenshot that I want to show them. Scroll down to see the web, blah, blah, blah. And it just basically goes through, and it runs automatically with this. So this is really nothing more than just the demonstration, except I've done it through a narrated PowerPoint. Now, there are some things that we can actually do this way and some things that you can't. Okay, some things, again, if you're doing certain demonstrations, Maybe you can do it this way, maybe you can't. This is one of those things that you need to think about as you are designing your course, and knowing when you're going to have synchronous sessions, knowing when you're going to have face-to-face, and knowing when you're going to have asynchronous, and then see where that whole big puzzle fits together. Because a giant Rubik's Cube is what it becomes, where you now have to decide, can I do something like this asynchronously, and does that work? Or, you know what, this is one of those things, yeah, I need to have them here in front of me, so I'm going to really lock this in and figure out how to incorporate that while I've got them in front of me, either synchronously or asynchronously if you can. So it becomes a little bit of a challenge, but it's still quite doable. Okay, it's just something that you have to think through. So we've got that, and we've figured whether in whatever manner we have now demonstrated the 6 steps, and with all the little sub-steps that go as well. The third phase here is where we give them a guided practice. We show them everything that has to be done. And if you think about it, this is exactly what you do in your classrooms. You just may not have broken it down in these 5 steps, but it's exactly what you're doing. So the next phase is the teacher provides a structured initial practice. Here's what I do. If I've got my students in a face-to-face setting for something like this, and if I was teaching them how to do announcements and hyperlinks, I would demonstrate this in front of them, and then have them in a practice. I usually set up a lab shell for this for Blackboard, and then I'll have them right in front of me. Say, okay, everybody, let's just go into this lab shell, and I want you to create an announcement. It can be anything you want. Just let them play around with it, let them practice it, let them see how to do it. And this is where, while they're doing it, I'll move around the room and answer any questions that they have, or check to see if they're doing it correctly or if they're in the right place. It's just a way to give feedback and let them know that they're right. And it's a good thing, because go back to that skill thing we talked about last week in Bloom. They're not naturalized to that process. They're just learning at the low end of Bloom's on that. So think yourself, how would you create an initial practice? What would you have the students do? Like I said, I used a lab shell. I can also do that synchronously, where I ask the students, okay, I've just demonstrated this to you. I've just shown it. Now go in, and I usually have it set where they have their own lab shell, or I have one. Sometimes I'll do it where I have one big lab shell where everybody is in that shell as an instructor, which means they can go in and manipulate and change and add and delete and do all that stuff. I always try and tell them, don't mess with anybody else's file. But basically, you can kind of take a look at folks' stuff. If I'm doing this asynchronously, it works just as well for something like this, so that any one of the 3 modalities could be utilized for a computer-based skill like this. Now, it doesn't mean everything can be done, and this is where you have to kind of figure that out. So what would you do, and how would you do the guided practice? After you do this, you got to figure out how you're going to give them feedback and how you're going to do what we call checking for understanding. The checking for understanding fits into the formative evaluation process. This is a very, very strong component of direct instruction. You're checking to see, are the students getting it? Do they understand? Are they doing things correctly? And this is a very important time, because you are basically providing feedback as to what they're doing right and correcting behaviors that are not done correctly. So you're checking to see if they are doing things accurately. So how would you go about checking for understanding, or checking to give them feedback, positive or critical instruction where you correct errors? In a face-to-face, that's pretty simple and easy. It's what I said before. You walk around, you observe. As you see what they're doing, you just correct behaviors. Yep, that's very good. You got it. Answer questions, those kind of things. Or if you see somebody's having trouble, you just give them a little extra instruction, and it's fine. In a synchronous setting, basically what we could do is just have students share through Google or Collaborate, and either one of those allow you to have the students share. Like I'm presenting now, they share their screen. You can have them share their screens and talk them through, and if they're having trouble, you can walk them through that way. In an asynchronous, basically what I do is I go in and observe their shell, and I'll be available through email, or even sometimes I've set up discussion boards just for questions like those kind of things. It's done asynchronously, which means it's not done in that same time and space kind of deal, so there's a separation of answer but I've found that it works as well. The fifth phase is what we call extended practice. This is where you are basically providing them an authentic experience where they're going to now apply what they've just learned and see where that fits into the total scheme of things. So you set the conditions for extended practice with the idea of transferring that skill, okay, to something that is more real. Basically, what I will do with that is one of the bigger assignments that I have is that they will create a lesson online. And one of the parts is that they have to put an announcement, and they have to go from that announcement and hyperlink into wherever it is that you want them to go, or they want their students to go with that. So it's just another example of how you put it into the bigger picture or show where it applies in their world. So what would you establish as an extended practice to assist them to transfer the skill or knowledge and make it a more authentic experience? If you don't show them where it's going to apply or help them to understand where they can apply it, then they're going to be lost. And it goes back to that same thing we were talking about before. It's just the idea of testing. If they're going to test for something, they'll memorize the information, come in promptly and spit that out and not really remember anything. So you want to make it more authentic where they understand. Basically, what I do is have them insert announcements and a hyperlink into a bigger project or a lesson. So that's basically the direct instruction model. That's basically how we teach. This is a little more formalized approach. Some instructors do this very well and they do it innately. Some instructors do a lot of this, but they kind of miss a couple of steps. Mostly what people miss is that extended practice part. And they assume that students will put this into their own venue without really you directing them, or without any direction beyond here. I just gave you some basic practice. I go figure out where it applies. You need to put that into the lesson so that they do understand the bigger picture, and that allows them to process it. And I'm not saying you have to give them where this is going to apply, but you have to give them the experience to understand where and how they would apply whatever it is that you're teaching them into their own venues. Let's talk a little bit about cooperative learning. What is cooperative learning? Anybody know? What's cooperative learning? We hear the term, it's an educational term, but I guarantee every one of you are doing it in some way, shape, or form in your classes. Basically, cooperative learning.
Is it when the student and teacher agree that the information is necessary to understand and apply?
Well, that's important, but that's not what cooperative learning is. Cooperative learning is something a little different, very close, but cooperative learning is just basically group work. When you think about this, think of all the group work that you have put students in over the years. You know, you have them work in group assignments, you have them work collective. You can do short assignments in class where you partner them up with somebody to do something. You can have them do larger projects. But the whole idea behind cooperative learning is group work. Every one of us have done group work. Okay? What's the value of group work? Well, group work has a lot of pluses to it. Basically, what's happening with cooperative learning is students are working in teams with the idea of learning things. The teams can include racial, cultural, gender mixes. They can be heterogeneous. They can be homogeneous. Teams are comprised potentially of high, average, and low achievers. You can mix them up. You can, put them all the same. You can do what you want. The group reward as well as individual rewards. Now, before we go any further, what is the major complaint? Especially when you are doing a group project that is going to be graded. How many of us hated that? And why? Dawn is raising her hand. Jamie's shaking her head.
Yeah, I think everybody.
Yeah, it's very difficult to determine who did what on the project. What like some people work harder than others. I always have if they build a system or are doing something in a group, I have them evaluate each other. Because Mary and Bill did all the work and Joe didn't do anything. And if you have Mary and Bill then evaluate Joe anonymously, that works.
You're absolutely right, Paul. You got a couple of scenarios that I've seen happen where, you always get the couple of people that do all the work, and sometimes they do it begrudgingly, and then you got the third or fourth person in the group, or however many you put in a group, and they don't do anything. You know, they don't show up, but yet they take all the credit and they get the same point values. So yeah, that's kind of iffy. I do the exact same thing Paul does. I actually, the rubric that I use, which we'll talk a little bit more on Wednesday, the rubrics I use, I basically send out and have everybody evaluate everybody else in your group. And it's just a way for me to get some insights and feedback on who did what and how, and you start to see things, and then I adjust points accordingly.
So Rich, I don't do the self-grading, because a lot of times students pick their groups and they pick with friends and they won't grade them bad or give them bad marks. But what I do require is a table of contents listing each person's participation, showing me what they did. And if a person in their group did not do their part, the other group members can leave that blank, and that just goes in the table of contents, and it's just not done. And then everybody's graded, you know, fairly according to what they did.
Perfect. Sounds good. It's one of those things. Anything that you can utilize that establishes the framework for who did what and gives you some insight is a good thing. Okay, it's absolutely. The other complaints that we see is, you know, you got 3 or 4 people in a group, and one person takes over and does all the work because you know they don't want their grade to suffer, so they don't trust anybody else. They're going to do it all, which means the other 2 or 3 people just don't learn as much. And then you got the complaint where you get somebody that didn't do anything, and the other people, it's just economies of scale in the workload. And this goes back to what Karen's talking about. You know, there is value in this in the group reward, because you get the individual components and then things come together, and it is a positive thing. You know, cooperative learning goals, it really teaches a lot of things about real life and authenticity. I mean, think about this. We rarely work in isolation. So it does start and begins to teach us tolerance and acceptance of diversity and different people. You know, and I don't just mean gender and culture and ethnicity and religion and all that. It's just different ways and different things. It's just how we approach things. You start to learn to tolerate other people's views, and it's not just your way. Now, the person that comes in and takes over the group, they're not learning that yet. It also, I think, go ahead, Anne.
A question here.
Sure.
I have not found tolerance nor acceptance of diversity to work in the doctoral. I have found that once they know who's smart, who's not, who's great at English, who's not, and I've even had people come up and tell me they refuse to work with other people in their group. Sure. How do I, as a teacher, have better classroom management with that?
Well, this becomes an issue. And here's the thing, and Karen brought it up before, and several of you, Paul said, a lot of the students, a lot of times it's just easier to let the students pick. But what I have found when I have done that, and it's been my own ignorance and I haven't meant to, but in doing such, I've found that, and I think you're right in this from the pure definition of diversity that we're utilizing these days, where we have a variety of different cultural experiences. We have people from different ethnicities. We have people from different countries and different cultures. And sometimes certain students are not open to that, and they just want to stick to their own kind. That's not just always what I meant by tolerance and acceptance of diversity. I'm thinking of diversity of ideas, diversity of perspectives, just the whole thing. But you're absolutely right. And a couple of times that I've done that, where I said, okay, everybody just pick your groups and let's get into groups of 3 or 4, and then we'll do the big project. And I've had some of the foreign students, when I first started doing that, come up and say, Dr. Fuller, I'd really prefer, would it be better for you to have placed us, because then all the foreign students end up together. I think you have to know your group. I think you have to understand your groups. And there are some times that it's fine just to let students pick their own groups. And there are other times that you want to specifically structure the groups to have more representation of different groupings. And a student comes up and says, well, I just refuse to work with that student. And that's where you have to be not dictatorial, but you have to be strong in your classroom management. Simply say, well, I'm sorry, this is the way the groups are, and you're just going to have to participate with it. Because if you think about this a second, this is where we are in our work life. We rarely, I haven't found it to be, you rarely get to pick who you work with. And that's what life is. And this is what when you start talking about the social skills, This is teaching that tolerance. It's teaching how you work with people, whether you like them, you don't like them, whether you want to work with them, you don't want to work with them. That's just the way life is. Every job I've ever had, I never had the opportunity to say, well, no, I'm not going to work with you and I'll work with this. It just doesn't happen. You also work with the idea of academic achievement. The cooperative learning or the group work really increases, and if it's done right, it really will increase the academic achievement of students. I want you to put this into perspective. When we talk about cooperative learning lessons, that's drilling down to individual lessons or individual projects, whether it be a class project for the next couple of hours, something that you're having them do together, or for the next 15 minutes. Here, I want everybody to read this article. Let's talk about it, and then we'll share it in the bigger group. Or it's a bigger project where, okay, I want you to write a group paper. The 5 of you go out and do that, or do a presentation, or explore something, or whatever it happens to be. Maybe it's a group computer project where they're writing a program and they can divide all kinds of things. But think about this a second. Both of our PhD programs are cohort models, are they not? Cohorts are a cooperative learning model in and of itself over the course of a 3-year period of time. So they're intermixed. The only thing that changes in our program is every 8 weeks they get a new instructor. In your program, it's what, every 15 weeks they get a new instructor that rotates in front of them. That is still a cooperative learning. They're learning as much, and I've always said this, they're learning as much from each other as they are from the instructor and the content and the program in general. So, you know, you will start to find, in fact, if you sit back and look, you get that they've already kind of grouped themselves out anyway, you know, just on a day-to-day basis without assignments. So that may be a situation that you want to make things a little bit more diverse, where you take more control of that. You could do it randomly, you could do it with purpose, or you could let them choose. That's your choice, and it goes to the objective of what it is that you're looking to accomplish. Cooperative learning is based upon the work of John Dewey, specifically from his 1916, which amazes me that his work still 100 years later is still hailed and still utilized. In fact, it has a tremendous impact on teaching in all 3 areas that we're talking about: face-to-face, synchronous, and asynchronous. In his book, Democracy in Education, Dewey stated that the classroom should mirror the larger society. So basically what he was saying is the classroom should be a place where students learn things of what they're going to apply and where they're going to use it. The whole idea of just learn something in isolation, spit it back out on a test, and then promptly forget it was foreign to Dewey. And he saw that it really played no role and had no part in education. It's basically where teachers create a learning environment that uses democratic procedures and basically scientific processes. Now, there are some different examples of some things that you can do. You can set up what are called STADs, or student achievement divisions. Now, this is usually, it's done in the K through 12 setting for 4 or 5 member teams. You use text or verbal based lessons. You can use worksheets or other devices, online materials, for example, where students work together to help each other learn the material. So they're teaching each other, they're learning with each other. You have weekly and bi-weekly tests or projects. Now, this is done within higher education, and we have seen this. One of our instructors in education utilizes this model when they teach statistics. They will break students up into groups of anywhere between 2, 3, and 4, depending upon the size of the group, depending upon the situation, graduate, undergraduate, or doctoral. They will break up the groups and put teams together. They have weekly lessons and materials. Now, these are narrated PowerPoints that the instructor does, specifically for online, even for the on-ground. This instructor will do face-to-face instruction where she'll do some, basically, you want to think about, do some direct instruction, provide additional materials, provide the resources through SPSS, provide a lot of different things, and then give them data and ask them to set up different scenarios or different analysis of data utilizing different statistics that are appropriate. She has them work in teams. She gives them a weekly quiz based upon that. There is a project that is done weekly. and this is how the students are learning. She then gives all kinds of feedback. Another instructor does the exact same thing where they will get online and give feedback to this. So this is what is called student achievement divisions, where you're having them learn together and they're learning from each other. Sometimes you may want to pit a stronger student that you know with a weaker student. If you know that somebody is just not, they don't have the proclivity to go with statistics, they're just not strong in math, and they're frightened of this, and you have another student who is very solid in this area, that may be somebody you want to team up and partner with.
Do you use them in the doctoral program? The
I'm sorry, say that again?
Do you use the student achievement divisions in your doctoral program?
Not formally. In other words, we don't divide that up and say, okay, we're going to have this dad group. No, it's just, I think it's done project-based wise by individual instructors. I've utilized it for different things. It's just another way for group investigation. It's another way for them to get into it. We don't, in some K through 12 settings, they will actually divide up and do that on a formalized basis for, maybe a 4 to 5 week period of time or a 9-week period of time. In higher education, we don't do that because we don't have those kind of time, and things are a little more compressed in what we're doing. A lot of times instructors will utilize those, specifically for project-based type things. But it's basically the same thing as you break it down. One of the things that most of us do will have what we call group investigation. It's where students are grouped heterogeneously. And sometimes you want students that are grouped homogeneously. It just depends. Like groups, dissimilar groups, it's your choice. It's what you want, and it's what fits the objective, and it's what's going to help. So for me to say, well, this is what you have to do in every situation, it's wrong. This is what we talk about with instructor discretion. This is the academic freedom that you're talking about throughout that we all discuss. So you choose an area to study. Okay, a lot of times this can be just something that they want to do, a project, whatever, and they then present their findings to the group. It can be something in a paper, it could be a presentation, it could be a project that they're doing. Statistics, you might give groups, I've seen this done with math, where you give them different projects, different things to analyze, and then they present their data and show how they broke it down. So how can we teach all of this in each of these 3 modalities that we're talking about? Face-to-face, sometimes that's a little easier because you just simply have them go off, do the work as groups, do the, where we set that up in the classroom. Sometimes you give time in class to do that. Although I don't generally do that because, the face-to-face time that we have with students is very precious time and it's very limited. So I usually don't do as much of that. I may give some time for them to kind of plan and meet and do what they're doing. But I don't take a lot of time because I would not think about giving an hour, 2 hours of class time for something like that, just to do their planning. I will, though, when they come back in to present, utilize time together for the presentations, and that's part of class time. The synchronous, you can utilize things like the Blackboard Collaborate, which if you've explored Blackboard Collaborate, really does have some really neat features. It's got some bells and whistles. In fact, it's got all the bells and whistles. The Blackboard, we have 2 accesses, Blackboard Collaborate and then the Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. The Ultra has more bells and whistles, and I find it to be a little easier to use once you learn it. But what you do have in both of those is you have breakout rooms. In other words, where you can group students and you can send them off to different rooms within a different session. Google Hangouts does not have that access. In other words, I can't provide access for students to do breakout rooms. In other words, I couldn't put you all in different breakout rooms right now. It's just not set up to do that. I believe certain versions of Zoom have that. I believe that upper level versions of Google Hangouts has that. But we have access to that through Blackboard Collaborate. I've utilized it. Not too terrible to figure out how to do it. It's pretty simple and pretty easy. One of the things that we're doing is we're utilizing this for right now for any doctoral defenses that we have, for any of the chapter 1 to 5, for any of the 1 to 3s. And we'll have the student come in, do their presentation, do their defense. We'll ask all the questions. And then instead of kicking them off like we would do if they're doing a Google and then calling them to come back in, I've shoved them in another room. And then the group will the faculty will get together, talk. When we're done talking, we've made our decision, they've passed, they failed, whatever they've done, I go over into the other room, get them, bring them back in. It's really pretty simple. So this is also something you could do if you're having a class. You could say, okay, you 3 or 4 people go to this room, you 3 or 4 people go to this room, you go to and you can go in and check and see what they're doing and answer any questions that they have. So that's an opportunity. You can do offline group assignments where they work together and coordinate, then present on Google or Blackboard, collaborate. You know, these are options and things for you to consider. You can do this asynchronously, group narrated presentations. I did this 2 years ago, and I wasn't sure how it was going to work because I was working with a totally distant group. In other words, they were spread all over the country and had a couple of people in different countries, one in Hawaii, different time zones, the whole thing, and just wasn't sure how it was going to work. And I had them broken up into groups of 4, and they were actually exploring different aspects of leadership theory. And it was something that was pre-approved. Their group would do this. Group 1 would do something on, servant leadership. Group 2 would do something else, and all the different theories that we talked about or things that they wanted to bring in. And they spent some time, and every one of them participated and did narrated PowerPoints. It was actually kind of cool because a couple of the groups were introducing each other as if they were standing in front of the room. And they said, okay, well, Adam has completed his, and now Kelly's going to take over and explain such and such. And it was just a very neat transition. And I knew they were geographically nowhere near each other. So basically what they were doing is they were all doing their narrated PowerPoints, and one of the group was putting it all together. Worked out very well, was very seamless. We used a discussion board afterwards, and it was perfect. It just worked out well. The other things that you can do are called the jigsaw method. Some of you may have heard about this. And the jigsaw method is really very simple. Let me give you an example of what you can do. And what I've done with this is you can have a group that maybe reads something like an article. So if I had time in this session, I would divide maybe you up into groups of 4. And you would have a home team, and each one of you would be given a letter, A, B, C, and D, or in this case, purple, orange, green, and white, whatever you wanted to do. And you, in that home group, you would take a look at an article or a part of a concept that you wanted them to learn. And they would explore maybe 1/4 of that article, break it up chunk it out into 4 parts. And you assign the purple to read the first part, the orange to read the second part, the green the third, and the white the 4th part. Then they go off into, quote, expert groups. So everybody that has purple and was reading the first part would get together. Everybody who was orange reading the second part would get together, green and white and so on. They would spend a few minutes reviewing their particular area, talking about the components that are strong within their area and what they need to explain and what they need to do, and they become experts in that particular component. Then they come back to the home teams, and in order they start to explain what the article was all about or what the part was all about. This now is where everybody is teaching everybody else, and everybody is learning from everybody else about a particular component or about a particular area. It's a very, very powerful way to learn. It takes a little coordination and takes a little bit of time on your part, but it can be done. It generally is pretty easy to do in a face-to-face setting. I have done it in a synchronous setting like this where I've sent the students off into different rooms. It takes a little more time, but it still works. And it can be done asynchronously, but that would be over a greater period of time, and you would do it in a discussion board. I've done debates like that. I did a team debate in an online, and I think there's an example of that in one of the Blackboard, in one of the lessons on the Center for Innovative Teaching page. Project-based learning, very quickly we'll go through some of that. Project-based learning is the idea, and you hear it as project-based, some people call it problem-based, that's fine. The increasingly popular term is problem-based, but it really refers to the same thing. It can have a number of different meanings depending upon the design of the educational method and what it is that you are looking to teach and how you are skilled in that manner. Learning is basically driven by open-ended problems. In other words, you establish a problem, something for them to research. You put this into a context-specific environment. This is where the students become very, very self-directed in what it is that they want to learn and how they're going to learn it. And actually, they become very, very active investigators and problem solvers. So basically what you're doing is you establish and help the student to identify a particular problem, and they will take time to explore solutions. So your role here is more of that of a facilitator. In fact, that's more of what adult learning is. And if you think about it, this is what most of us do anyway. We facilitate students to do certain things. How many of you have students write papers? Do they all write the exact same paper? Do they take the problem or the issue or the topic, if you will, and go off and run with it and how they're going to apply it in their own area? If I'm doing certain things like in leadership classes that I teach, or if I'm teaching a technology-based class, I allow them to pick certain areas of interest that they want to explore more deeply, where they're going to get into the research, they're going to get into the literature, and then they're going to come back and after they've analyzed that, synthesize that into their own area. This works along the lines of Bloom's taxonomy within the cognitive domain at the higher order thinking. So they're not just rotely spitting information out, they're now applying this. They're now analyzing, they're now evaluating things. So these are all higher order thinking skills that you're doing. Your role as a facilitator is to assist them, to help them to inquire in a more deep way. Proponents of PBL, people who really support this, say it develops critical thinking skills, it improves problem solving skills, it increases motivation because students now can explore more things of what they are interested in and what's going to apply in their own venue. They can transfer that knowledge to those new situations that are applicable to them. Now these fall under the ideas, and I utilize, in fact, in all honesty, I don't do a whole lot of testing these days. In fact, I can't even think about the last time I've given a test. I do papers, I do projects, I will do larger assignments. In some of the courses I teach, they will usually do group work, they will do group projects together, they will present on different things, they will explore different things. That's through leadership, that's through some of the curriculum design courses I teach, that's also through some of the tech courses I teach. I have them do those things, but I also get them into the research literature and have them explore different issues and problems that exist, and then they write a paper about it. I think it also teaches and utilizes a variety of other skills. It's not just simply rote learning. They are actually out there analyzing, they're actually out there researching things, they are actually out there analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating. I find one of the greater things to do is a research paper, which I know we all do. But I also will incorporate a lot of different projects where, example, one of the classes I teach is how you teach online, or at least a component of that. So I will have them do a project where they develop an online lesson. Or if it's a larger course that I've taught, I have them develop an online curriculum. You know, those are things that can be done. These, I think, can be done in all three modalities: face-to-face, synchronous, asynchronous. You set those up because basically this is student-driven. They're doing it under your guidance. Case studies and simulations. Caffarello defines a case study as a small group who analyzes and solves an event. Situation presented orally, in written form, or through computer-based learning, with the idea that a story is told and analysis is performed and a solution is developed. It's very much like problem-based learning, but you provide cases for them. I find that within a lot of the things that I teach, I provide different cases which allow a lot of open discussion, allow a lot of different analysis where you can sit down and break down the pros and cons of one thing over another. Within the idea of case study, there are three essential elements. It is real or based upon reality. And a lot of times you want to give them case bases of things that have actually happened. Requires the learner to research and study to understand what the scenario is, what the whole breakdown. So this becomes the analysis part. And it develops multiple views or perspectives based upon the information. That is synthesis and overall evaluation, which again is higher order thinking. Of those three, problem-based learning, simulations, and case study, they're used very heavily in science, medicine, engineering, computer, education. They can be set up as individual type things. They can be set up in groups. They can be structured to do just about anything you want. They do take more time. Let's face it, it is far more efficient to stand up in front of a classroom and deliver a lecture on something in 30 minutes. You can cover a ton of information in 30 minutes, but how much are your students learning in that 30 minutes? Just because you've said it does not mean that they have internalized it. You want to make them active learners more than passive learners. So think about that in your lessons. If you go back to what we talked about last Wednesday, under Bloom's taxonomy, the lower order thinking skills, the bottom 3 on Bloom's cognitive domain, those are lower order thinking. They're important, but that's just rote learning. That's part of the lecture. What you want to move them to is the higher order thinking skills and how they are going to apply these things. So you break the analysis and synthesis down. All right, there is an online pedagogical handout that you can go through, and it lists a whole bunch of things down the left-hand side: case studies, debate, demonstration, direct teaching, discussion, formative and summative evaluations, and what kind of things. These are things that we do. The left-hand column is through traditional face-to-face teaching that most of us have done all of our life. The big question is, how do you transition that information from what we do face-to-face and put it into some kind of an online, whether it is asynchronous or synchronous? It gives you another series of opportunities. There's about 2 pages here. I have it in very small font. I apologize. I think it's 8-point font. I don't know about you, but as I get older, my eyes don't do that. Feel free to, and I've left it as a Word document so that you can resize that and do it what you want. But it may give you some insight and some understanding as you kind of move through and do some different things with this. So, comments, questions. I mean, we could spend time going through this, but I'm not going to unless you have specific questions about anything that we've talked about today, or if you have questions about anything that you're not sure how to transition, or you have some objectives or some lessons that you're not sure what to do. Because my sense is if somebody has that question, there may be others that have that same question. So.
Rick, I have a question. I learned some of my faculty members are doing a collaborative research. Some of our doctoral students are involved in article writing and publication and so forth. I wonder if you could share some of the resources that you have on collaborative research as a method of learning and reaching the course objective.
Well, I think it's a very, very powerful way to learn. We have done some of that. I think it becomes an economy of scale thing. When you start, they learn many, many things through the cooperative learning, but they learn research. You know, sometimes students go into this and they're a little weaker and they're a little more timid with something. If they're partnered up with somebody, then there's not that whole burden that falls on them, and now they can share and they can learn from each other with that. I think that shared research, in fact, I think several of our faculty have published with their students, and that kind of guides them through that and makes it a very authentic learning experience. I think faculty who partner up with their students, I think is a very positive thing. I truly do. I think students partnering with each other. We have one of the courses that we have is a writing for publication. And it's one of those things that sometimes depends on who's teaching it in general, but they may choose to do something like what you're talking about, where you can do some group projects. In other words, how you would take your particular research, your particular dissertation, or even any other papers and do that. One of the things that I have done over the course of the last several years is when I found a student who was very good at writing. In other words, they had a paper that they submitted to me that was good, and I said, okay, if you just expand this is very publishable, and I will walk them through and help them to do something. If I've done a group project like that where I've come back and said, okay, folks, this is an excellent presentation that you did. This transitions very easily into a very publishable paper, and I've walked them through that process. This just becomes more, I think, Petrus, of what you're talking about is more of the authentic learning experience. Anything that is real that you can take. And think about this. This is what we are trying to teach our students to do, is to publish. You know, that's one of the skill sets that our students are trying to walk away with from our PhD programs, is the ability to write, the ability to critically analyze things, the ability to conduct research, and to publish.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have them write a paper in my class, and I would say that half the students had that paper published every year. That's one of the things. They write a paper on a topic in, well, business intelligence, data analytics, and it was always going to IASIS. The other thing is I would collaborate with them, but then in the past I was told that I should not do that. Do not publish with your students, which I thought, I thought, why not? But I don't know if anyone else remembers that or not. If we were told not to publish with our students, or don't do it.
You know what?
I thought that was silly, but that's.
Well, I have to tell you that that's something that's come to my attention, that the administration is potentially not going to accept for promotion or for category A FAR publications that are with students.
Yeah, I don't know. It's
and I don't
ridiculous.
know how to handle that, because we do have past practice. We have a faculty member who has won an award for research.
Yes.
And 4 of his publications were co-authored with students.
Yes.
And so I too am getting mixed messages on this.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we have an interview of faculty,